Okay. Well, hopefully you all can hear me. Not sure the best way to check, but the mic looks like it's on, so we're just going to roll with it. Okay, so here is the game plan for this video. This will take the place of our in-person lecture for Wednesday. And the topic today is working through how we can apply the criteria for good arguments within the context of a lesson or a sermon. Now, as you know, originally we were using the acronym C.R.A.W.L.S to describe the criteria for good argumentation. And one of the complaints I had, and I think some of you had with the acronym as it stood, was that alluring was doing this double duty of both referring to the rhetorical polish that we put onto an argument and also referring to using foundational premises that our target audience is likely to accept as true. Thankfully, Ben has helpfully expanded the acronym to C.R.A.W.L.S, which nicely gives us a slot for that rhetorical element and allows us to keep alluring. So starting now and likely for the remainder of the time we teach this material, or I teach this material, C.R.A.W.L.S will be the new acronyms, and so shout out to Ben for the help there. So that gives us 6 slots to cover. We're actually going to lump alluring and well-founded together. And what I'm going to do now is a little different than how we normally do this, which will not be in a Q&A style. Instead, we're just going to go through each of the letters in the acronym, and I'm going to give you general tips, principles for how to apply these various criteria within the context of a sermon or a lesson. So some of this will just come from personal experience, to be honest. Others, bits of it will come from books and resources specifically on teaching and preaching. And then third, I'm going to throw in a few quotes from Aristotle's book on rhetoric, which I think remains a helpful resource in these discussions to this day. So there's the game plan. Let's go ahead and jump in. So starting with clarity. You'll recall that what we meant by clarity is that your intended audience is able to discern both the point of your argument as well as the means by which you are justifying or arguing for the argument. In other words, if your presentation, whether it's written or spoken, is clear, your audience should be able, in their own minds, to construct your argument diagram. Now, obviously, what I mean by that is not that they'll know all the conventions, but instead, if they knew how to argument diagram and you were doing a clear piece of writing or a clear presentation, then they should be able, upon receiving your communication, to construct the argument diagram that you intended to represent your presentation. And in practical terms, I think what that means is we want sermons and lessons that are such that our intended audience knows the main point and is able to understand how we justify the main point. So how can we pull that off? I've got 3 suggestions for you. One is that you keep the argumentation simple, or rather you keep the whole presentation simple. And one component of that is simple argumentation. So if we're thinking about structuring a sermon or a lesson using the argument diagram technique, as I showed you in class, where at the top you've got the homiletical argument, and then one of the major premises of the homiletical argument is exegetical, and that's supported by an exegetical argument. So if you've got that in your head, I would recommend that particularly the homiletical argument have no more than 3 premises, and preferably 2. The reason being, and I know this from personal experience, once you get into that 3+ territory of major premises backing up your argument, it first of all just takes a large amount of time to get through each premise well. But secondly, it's very difficult for your audience in a spoken form and in a spoken communication context to follow along with it. And this is one of the trade-offs we have with spoken versus written communication, right? Spoken communication has all the advantages of presentation. There's facial expressions and hand gestures and voice modulation and all those things that can make words come alive. But the trade-off is it's not as easy in spoken communication to convey complex ideas in a nuanced way. And I would say that translating that principle to argument diagrams means that whereas in a paper, you could have multiple complex arguments supporting your thesis, in a presentation, you really want a single simple argument supporting your thesis because that tends to be all people can manage. Second, so that's one element of simplicity, a simple argument. Second, I think that generally speaking, we want to use language that is readily understood by our audience. Now, that doesn't mean never use colorful language or rare vocabulary, but it does mean that if the lion's share of your presentation is spoken using language that your audience cannot understand, then it's very likely they are not going to be able to discern your meaning. To give you an example of this, I assigned one time an academic debate video for a class to watch between two philosophers. And one complaint after the video was done was that it was very difficult to understand what each of the two debaters was saying. And the reason was they were viewing this as an academic debate, meaning they were using all the philosophy-specific language that philosophers would use within the discipline. And as a result, it made it very difficult for anyone that wasn't a philosopher to follow along. Similar things happen when we have sermons that are heavy with the language of exegesis or theology or just the academy with higher-minded vocabulary. Most congregations, most Sunday school classes are not going to be equipped to follow along with that. And so while it's okay to sprinkle those types of words and terms and concepts in there, for the main, we want to modulate our language to the vocabulary our audience is able to understand. To this point, here's a quote from Aristotle's Rhetoric that I think helpfully speaks to this point. The compact style, as he calls it, is that which is in periods. By a period, I mean a portion of the speech that has in itself a beginning and an end, being at the same time not too big to be taken in at a glance. Language of this kind is satisfying and easy to follow. It is easy to follow because it's easy to remember. And this because language, when in periodic form, can be numbered, and the number is the easiest of all the things to remember. So what is Aristotle saying there? He's saying that a couple of things. One is the recommendation that you treat your argument, your speech, in these packets that have nice beginnings and ends to them, and you break it up that way rather than just doing a running speech with no breaks in it. And in doing that, your audience is able to discern the individual components. They can see the beginning and end of each component. And if you do it that way, then people can, in a sense, count them, right? All right, that was point one, point two. I'm able to track along. And likewise, I think one way that you can convey clarity through simplicity is to have each premise serve as kind of a unit, an encapsulated unit of your presentation, where you're like, okay, this is what the text says. We're going to walk through that. Here's the point of the text. Here's my bridge premise. Here's how I'm going to add that. We put them together. You get your thesis. And when you've broken it up that way, where each part of the lesson or sermon is an individual unit, and maybe you even number them so that people can follow along, it's easier to track and easier to remember. So that's simplicity. Use simple language, use simple arguments, and when possible, keep them kind of lumped together in these individual silos. Second point under clarity is to utilize recaps and repetition. One of the biggest hindrances, I believe, to clarity in sermons or really Sunday school lessons, is the propensity of teachers to feel that they have to use the totality of their time delivering new information to the audience. So that whether it's 20 minutes or 40 minutes, or heaven forbid, an hour-long sermon or lesson, every second is spent giving new information to the audience. And while in one sense that's helpful in that it is delivering a high quantity of information to the audience, in another sense, it detracts from the possibility of greater clarity, because clarity in written or in spoken communication, unlike in some ways written communication, heavily depends on repetition. And if you've ever had a conversation with somebody, which hopefully everybody has, you'll know this is true, that oftentimes you end up having to repeat yourself several times in different ways before the other person really gets to a point where they understand your meaning. And I'd say the same holds true in teaching and preaching, that to really get your point across clearly, you need to repeat it. So what might that look like? My recommendation is, one, you could begin the lesson or sermon by just giving a high-level overview of what you're about to argue for to your audience. And this, if you're using the argument diagram, would be as simple as saying, here's my thesis and here's my argument in support of my thesis. So you would basically just be taking the claim box and then all the top level boxes that point to it and summarizing that for your audience. Second, at transition points throughout the lesson, and if you're doing Aristotle's suggestion of each unit or each part of the lesson or sermon being its own unit, there should be transitions between those, right? At minimum, you'll want transitions between each major premise in your argument supporting your conclusion. And that's not a bad place to pause and just briefly summarize to your audience everything you've covered thus far, where you're about to go, and how it all fits together in defense of your thesis. And if you do that 3 to maybe even 5 times, depending on the length of the sermon or lesson, it sticks in the mind of your audience much better. So those are the 2 recommendations for clarity. Keep it simple and use recap and repetition. Next, we move on to rhetorical. Sorry, I'm looking for a time marker because I do not see one right now. Well, we'll let me check it this way. Okay. We're doing well. Okay, so next we're on to rhetorical. Here I'm going to draw upon a book, which I may actually have since I'm in my house, readily available. Or maybe I don't. Looks like I don't. Okay, never mind. We're going to draw upon a book called Preaching with Bold Assurance by Herschel York, who was one of my preaching professors, and I believe Decker was the co-author with him on that. But anyways, in one of the latter chapters of the book, Decker and York delineate 9 elements of good preaching style. And this is really what the new R, and now that we've expanded from clause to crawls, is getting on about. That the idea behind the rhetorical part is that good argumentation is presented well. And one of the ways to do that, or rather the ways to do that, one of the best presentations of the elements that go into that within the context of preaching and teaching I've seen comes from the book Preaching with Bold Assurance by these 2 authors. So I know there's 9, which may sound like a lot, but we're going to go through these rather quickly. Number 1 is eye communication. Now, if you are a manuscripter, which, just as a reminder, argument diagramming and manuscripting, not necessarily at odds, right? You can use the argument diagram as a stepping stone to writing your manuscript. And I think there's lots of advantages to that, because then you don't get lost in the weeds and forget your macro structure when you're writing the manuscript. But if you're a manuscripter, legendarily, one of the most difficult elements of good communications with that delivery method is that your eyes are down on your notes and you avoid eye contact. And it is a fairly well-established fact about human communication at this point that eye contact is crucial for capturing people's attention. But there's extremes on both sides of this, right? One extreme is always looking down at your notes. The other extreme is fixating on one person or one point and never really deviating from that. So what's the happy mean in the middle? Well, York and Decker recommend a 5-second rule, and they admit that this comes with practice, but the idea is you fixate on different people or different points in the congregation, and you hold your gaze there for roughly 5 seconds before moving on. I'd add to that, as just a point of personal experience, that particularly when you're in a larger sanctuary or a larger room, it's not bad to pick out anchor points at different locations in the room. It could be individuals that you know, it could be particular objects that stick out to you, and you more or less just start cycling through those anchor points, holding your gaze for roughly 5 seconds at each one. And if you pick the right spots, typically people in that general zone are going to get the impression of eye contact with you. So you want to kind of spread it out to where you're cycling enough that each zone within the room has the impression you're making eye contact with them more or less. So that's one. Number two, gestures and facial expressions. So you do want to express yourself in public speaking, obviously. And as York once said to me, or to our class, it's useful to be a little bit extra. You want to be yourself, but in public speaking, you want to exaggerate just a bit more than you would in, say, a conversation with just a friend, because the distance of public speaking, whether it's teaching or particularly if it's a sermon, means that to convey the same amount of emotion you would want to in a personal conversation takes a little bit more expressive power. Second recommendation is that, particularly if you're standing, this is a little different when you're sitting, you have your hands at the side when not at use. Not fiddling around, not doing a nervous tick, not in your pockets, which can sometimes be a problem for me, but that you put them at your side. And it may feel uncomfortable for some, but I would commend to you that if you actually watch people that do this well, it looks much better than the fidgeting or the hand in the pocket, say, or one of those other things. Not a hard and fast rule, but I think a good general rule. And then the last thing they recommend is that you have a natural smile by default. Obviously, you don't want to be smiling at weird times. You don't tell a sad story and smile. That's how you come off as a sociopath. You do, however, want to have a pleasant demeanor, as that tends to, particularly in a public speaking context, engender you to the audience. All right, that's two. Number three is posture and movement. A recommendation here is move around, use your body to be dynamic, but don't move around continuously. I'll never forget, I saw a guy one time preaching one of his first sermons, and the entirety of the sermon was a rapid pacing back and forth across the stage, and often he was bent over looking down at the ground on one side and then doing the same on the other side. And it made the whole sermon difficult to follow because his movement was so distracting. But then the flip side is, if you've seen people who sometimes are just statues up there on the stage, they're not particularly engaging or dynamic. So what's the happy median? And again, York and Decker's recommendation is to pick a few spots on the stage, stand there for a bit, and then move on. Likewise, they recommend standing up straight. If you've ever seen two people I've seen this transformation happen with. One is Al Mohler, the other is C.J. Mahaney. Particularly Al Mohler. Al Mohler walks sometimes with a bit of a hunch, but the moment that guy is behind a podium, you can literally see him pop up all the way. It's almost like a transformation. And what I picked this as an illustration because the air of authority, the presence changes dramatically from something as simple as being hunched over to standing straight up. Number 4, dress and appearance. Recommendation here is to find the balance between being yourself. You don't want to wear something that's totally out of character for you, but also dressing appropriate for your audience and the occasion. You are probably not going to dress the same if you are doing an FCA presentation to some high school basketball students as you would if you were preaching a funeral or possibly teaching a Sunday school class. And so you need to know the occasion and the audience and dress appropriately. Number 5, using your voice. Here, similar to facial expressions, the recommendation is you do want to use the whole range of your vocal patterns, right? If you've ever listened to somebody that's very monotone, it's difficult to stay interested in what they're saying because eventually the monotone nature of the voice drifts into background noise. So you do want to modulate your voice. You don't want to be ridiculous about it, but you probably do need to aim, and this is another Yorkism, you need to aim to have more vocal range in a sermon or a lesson than you would in just normal conversation for most of us. And typically, I'd say it's the case if you do this enough that people think their voice is ranging more than it actually is. You probably sound less dramatic than you think you sound when you do this. All right, so that's voice. Number 6, words and fillers. Generally speaking, you want to avoid using fillers like or blue or things like that. Yeah, it's better to simply remain silent than to meander with your words or use unnecessary fillers. Number 7, humor. Recommendation is have some. I'm going to skip number 8, listener involvement, as I think it really just recaps many of the things said thus far. And the last one is be natural or be yourself. And I would recommend that this is really the most crucial element of good teaching or preaching or any kind of public presentation. And here's another quote from Aristotle on this point. We can now see that a writer must disguise his art and give the impression of speaking naturally and not artificially. Naturalness is persuasive. Artificiality is the contrary. For our hearers are prejudiced and think we have some design against them, as if we were mixing their wines for them. So what's Aristotle's point there? His point was that you ought to deploy the techniques of rhetoric in such a way that your audience does not know that what you are doing is rhetorical, right? And typically, the only way to accomplish this is to practice the components of good presentation until you've gotten to a point that they're just part of how you naturally act. And in general, I would say that the reason this is so important is people are inherently drawn, as Aristotle noted, to integrity and genuineness. And they tend to revolt against anything that feels artificial. Meaning that the best thing you can do when you step into a pulpit or you step into a classroom is be yourself. And that means faults and all, right? We don't, all of us, have natural airs of gravitas and that kind of presence that just captures everyone in the room with the weightiness of our personality, nor are we all comedic geniuses. We typically have a mix of things that make us us. And when people see the genuine us on display, that is attractive. And I find that one of the biggest hangups for people when they first start preaching or teaching is they try to mimic somebody else that they look up to. And while that can be a helpful tool, I think the danger becomes it begins to feel artificial because they are not the other person. So that's the last one. Be genuine. All right. The first 2 points, clarity and rhetoric, really were the areas where we have the most to say. The rest should be pretty straightforward. So moving on, thirdly, to both alluring and well-founded, I'd say the key here is to ground all major premises of the argument, if possible, directly in Scripture. Minimally, to be a biblical sermon or biblical lesson or an expository sermon, expository lesson, at least one of the 2 major premises leading to your conclusion ought to be an expository one or an exegetical one, meaning it's a statement of the meaning of the text. But if possible, it's beneficial to have all the premises grounded in the text. And then I would say, if you do end up needing to insert a premise not grounded in the text, it ought to either be trivial or you should have solid argumentation backing it up. What needs to be avoided, if we are sticking with the standards of good argumentation deployed in the context of a sermon or a lesson, is pontificating from the pulpit or in the classroom about our opinions on matters without any substantive argumentation to back it up. The reality is, teachers of the word are there not to speak from their own authority, but to speak from the authority of Scripture. And that means it is not the appropriate context in which to simply be spewing forth our own views on the world. So that's alluring and well-founded. Next is loving. You'll recall that we've used several times throughout this class the more Thomistic definition of love, that to love something means both that you seek the good of that object and you seek to be united with that object. And in the context of a lesson or a sermon, what that means is that you have those desires, you're disposed in that way towards the people you are preaching to, the congregation or the Sunday school class or small group that you're teaching to. So how can this be fostered? This is really more of a spiritual formation question, but these are 2 general points that I think hold across the board. Is that obviously our walk with the Lord in general impacts how we love and care about his church. So that if our walk with the Lord is strong, we ought to be people that naturally love the church. Second, I would say that all virtues are first learned by acting contrary to desire until it becomes desire. And love is a virtue, which means that one of the ways we learn to love is simply to do the acts of love, even when the desire is not there, because that eventually turns into an action done with desire. We'll move on from that to our last one, just to wrap us up here, which is structure. So you'll recall that what we mean by structure is the strength of our arrows, right? And one of the ways you test the strength of your arrows is to ask yourself the question, if I've got a box here and a box here, and there's an arrow pointing from this box up to this one, given the truth of this premise, how likely is this premise or this conclusion to be true? And the more likely it is to be true, given the truth of this one, the stronger the arrow is between them. We also noted that deductive arguments give you maximum strength arrows. Why? Because the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. It's a certainty that the conclusion is true if the premises are, which is as strong as you could hope for the arrows to become. So, recommendations on structure within a sermon or lesson context. Recall that there's, at least in the framework we're using here, 2 arguments. The homiletical argument at the top, where you've got an exegetical premise, your bridge premise, and then your homiletical conclusion. My recommendation to you is to at least try using deductive arguments at that point. One, it adds clarity, and two, it adds strength or structure to the argument. The second argument was the exegetical argument, which was the argument supporting the exegetical premise, right? So if you're thinking of the diagram, your homiletical conclusion is here. You've got two boxes, a bridge principle and your exegetical conclusion, and then you've got your exegetical argument supporting that. This is where good hermeneutics and good exegesis come into play, and we don't really have time to survey those skill sets, but I'd say this is typically not going to be supported with deductive arguments. That's trickier to do, but it does need to be supported by the standards of good exegesis. All right, and that takes care of how to implement C.R.A.W.L.S in a sermon or lesson context when you're framing the whole thing as an argument. And I'll just end by saying this. This is, as I've mentioned before, by no means the only way to go about preaching or teaching. It's also likely not the best way to go about preaching or teaching. What it is one way you can use the skill set we've been developing in this class of argument diagramming and good argumentation in general you can use that skill set within the context of a lesson or sermon to good effect. That's it. I will see you all Friday, and take care.